Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the twisted world of ancient Rome's original sugar daddies. And trust me, these weren't your typical wealthy benefactors sliding into DMs with promises of designer handbags. Picture this. You're standing in the bustling forum Romanum at dawn, watching as hundreds of desperate men in threadbare togas grovel before their wealthy patrons, competing for scraps of attention like pigeons fighting over breadcrumbs. The air thick with incense, sweat, and barely disguised desperation, as grown men literally prostrate themselves for a chance at their next meal. You probably won't survive 5 minutes in this social hierarchy without someone powerful backing you, and the price of that protection might just be your dignity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global bedtime community come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back to the 6th century BCE, when Rome was still figuring out how to be Rome. The patronage system wasn't some sophisticated social contract. It was born from raw necessity and brutal pragmatism. Early Roman society divided itself into 2 distinct classes: the patricians, who owned land and held power, and the plebeians, who owned absolutely nothing and desperately needed protection. Think of it as the world's first officially sanctioned sugar daddy arrangement, except instead of luxury apartments and shopping sprees, clients received basic survival necessities. The relationship began with a ritual called applicatio, literally meaning attachment, where a plebeian would formally bind himself to a patrician family. You witness this ceremony taking place in the patron's atrium, surrounded by ancestral death masks watching from the walls like disapproving in-laws. The client places his hand in the patron's, swearing eternal loyalty not just to him, but to his entire bloodline. It's remarkably similar to feudal homage, except with more togas, and significantly more awkward power dynamics. What made Roman patronage unique was its reciprocal nature, at least on paper. Patrons provided protection, legal representation, and economic support, while clients offered political loyalty, military service, and social prestige through their numbers. A wealthy Roman measured his status not just by his property, but by how many clients showed up at his door each morning. Having hundreds of dependents following you around was basically the ancient equivalent of Instagram followers, except these followers could actually vote for you and fight in your private army. The early patron-client relationship was governed by something Romans called fides, a concept combining trust, loyalty, and sacred obligation. Breaking this bond was considered not just socially unacceptable, but spiritually dangerous. The gods themselves supposedly punished oathbreakers, which was convenient for patrons who needed to keep their clients in line. Historians still argue whether fids represented genuine religious belief, or was simply an effective social control mechanism designed to maintain the status quo. But here's where things get deliciously complicated. Patronage wasn't limited to the desperately poor. Wealthy Romans often became clients of even wealthier Romans, creating intricate webs of interdependence that would make modern social media influencer hierarchies look simple. You might be a patron to dozens of freedmen while simultaneously being a client to a senator, who himself might be client to a member of the imperial family. It was sugar daddies all the way up the social ladder. The relationship transcended death, binding entire families across generations. Your patron's son inherited you along with the furniture and family slaves. Imagine being passed down like a particularly useful household appliance. This hereditary aspect meant that some client families served the same patron families for centuries, creating dynasties of dependence that shaped Roman society for over 1,000 years. The morning greeting ritual, the gifts, the humiliating displays of submission, all of it became as fundamental to Roman identity as gladiatorial games and conquest. You wake before dawn in your modest Insulae apartment, joints aching from the thin mattress, knowing that your survival depends on the next few hours. The salutatio, the morning greeting ceremony, awaits, and arriving late means risking your patron's displeasure, and more importantly, your daily meal ticket. You hurry through the dark streets of Rome, joining the growing crowd of fellow clients, all converging on your patron's domus, like moths drawn to a particularly expensive flame. The scene outside your patron's house resembles a bizarre cross between a job fair and a religious pilgrimage. Dozens of men in their best togas, which for most means their only decent toga, cluster around the entrance, comparing gossip and sizing up the competition. You recognize the hierarchy immediately. The closest to the door stand the most favored clients, while newcomers and the currently out of favor hover at the periphery like social media accounts with low engagement rates. As the first light of dawn breaks over the Palatine Hill, the doors swing open with theatrical precision. Your patron emerges in his pristine white toga with a purple stripe denoting his senatorial rank, flanked by household slaves carrying the symbols of his office. The crowd immediately falls silent, and you feel that familiar knot in your stomach as grown men begin the daily ritual of competitive groveling. The salutatio follows a strict protocol that would make modern corporate hierarchies seem casual. Clients approach in order of importance, each offering their morning greeting with carefully calibrated degrees of subservience. The most favored receive actual conversation, and sometimes even a brief private audience. Mid-tier clients get a nod, and perhaps a few words about family or business. The bottom feeders, and you know exactly where you stand, receive a cursory acknowledgement, and the hope that tomorrow might bring better fortune. But here's the fascinating part. Your patron genuinely enjoys this daily ego massage. Roman aristocrats wrote extensively about the pleasure of seeing their clients assembled each morning, viewing it as visible proof of their social importance. Pliny, the younger, described his morning receptions with the satisfaction of a man counting his money, which, in a way, he was. Each client represented potential votes, potential military service, and potential social influence that could be deployed when needed. Ritual extends beyond mere greetings. Your patron might announce which clients will accompany him to the forum, the baths, or dinner parties, essentially deciding who gets to be seen in public with him that day. Being chosen for his entourage was like getting VIP access to the hottest club in Rome, except the club was just walking around the city looking important. Those selected would literally form a procession behind their patron, advertising his status to anyone paying attention. During these morning gatherings, you witness the delicate dance of gift-giving that lubricates the entire system. Clients present their patrons with small tokens, perhaps some choice fruit from their modest gardens, or a particularly well-crafted piece of pottery if they're artisans. The patron graciously accepts these offerings while mentally cataloging who gave what and how much it cost. Nothing in this relationship happens without calculation. The most successful patrons master the art of playing favorites without completely alienating the others. They might praise one client's poetry while commissioning another's craftwork, always keeping everyone slightly off balance and hungry for approval. It's remarkably similar to modern reality TV manipulation, except with higher stakes and less camera-friendly lighting. Historians still argue whether patrons genuinely cared about their clients' welfare or viewed them purely as social accessories. Contemporary sources suggest both attitudes coexisted, often within the same individual. A patron might genuinely worry about a favored client's sick child while simultaneously calculating how that client's gratitude could be leveraged for political advantage. The morning ritual concludes with the sportula, a small gift of food or money distributed to attending clients. Originally, this was an actual meal, but by the imperial period, it had evolved into a modest cash payment that allowed clients to buy their own breakfast. Think of it as the world's first daily tip system, except your livelihood depended on consistently earning those tips from the same person for potentially decades. As the sun climbs higher and the patron disappears into his house to begin his actual day, you join the stream of clients dispersing into the city. Some head to their own work, running small shops, practicing crafts, or managing other patrons' business interests. Others simply wait for the next opportunity to serve their patrons' needs, living in a constant state of availability that would make modern gig economy workers nod in recognition. You find yourself standing in your patron's study, surrounded by scrolls, wax tablets, and the intoxicating smell of expensive parchment, watching as he casually signs documents that will transform your family's future. This is where the real magic of Roman patronage happens, not in the public displays of morning greetings, but in these private moments where wealthy Romans demonstrate their power through strategic generosity that would make modern venture capitalists weep with envy. The gift-giving in Roman patronage operated on a scale that defies modern comprehension. Your patron might casually hand you a bag of gold coins equivalent to several years of a working man's wages, not out of pure altruism, but as an investment in your eternal gratitude and future services. These weren't birthday presents. They were calculated moves in a complex social chess game where money bought loyalty and loyalty bought power. Legal protection formed the cornerstone of the patron-client relationship. In a society where courts could be bought, witnesses intimidated, and justice often depended more on social connections than facts, having a powerful patron meant the difference between fair treatment and complete destruction. Your patron's legal network, comprising other senators, judges, and influential advocates, created an invisible shield around you that most Romans could never afford. When you faced legal troubles, your patron didn't just provide a lawyer. He provided an entire legal army. He might personally appear in court as your character witness, bringing along other high-ranking Romans to testify on your behalf. The opposing side would take one look at this parade of purple-striped togas and often reconsider their entire case. It was like having the best legal team money could buy, except you paid for it through decades of subservience rather than hourly fees. The loan system within patronage relationships operated with fascinating complexity. Unlike modern banking, these weren't commercial transactions with interest rates and payment schedules. They were social bonds that created permanent obligations. Your patron might lend you money to start a business, buy property, or cover family emergencies, but the real cost wasn't financial interest. It was social interest compounded over time. What made these loans particularly insidious was their ambiguous repayment terms. A patron rarely demanded explicit repayment schedules because the debt created ongoing leverage. You might spend years unsure whether you'd officially repaid your obligation, living in constant anxiety about when your patron might call in the favor. Some historians compare it to emotional manipulation, while others argue it was simply how Roman society managed economic relationships without formal banking systems. Housing represented another crucial benefit that patrons provided their most valued clients. Rather than cramming into disease-ridden apartment blocks with the urban masses, favored clients might receive comfortable lodging within their patron's household compound or in properties he owned throughout the city. Living in patron-provided housing meant better security, cleaner water, and proximity to power. But it also meant your landlord controlled every aspect of your personal life. The most sophisticated patrons created entire economic ecosystems around their client networks. A wealthy Roman might own vineyards, pottery workshops, shipping businesses, and urban properties, staffing them primarily with his clients and freedmen. This vertical integration meant that clients could earn steady incomes while remaining completely dependent on their patrons' continued goodwill. It was capitalism with a distinctly feudal flavor, mixing profit motives with personal loyalty in ways that made everyone slightly uncomfortable but undeniably wealthy. Marriage arrangements formed another avenue through which patrons demonstrated their power and secured their clients' futures. A well-connected patron could arrange advantageous marriages for his clients' children, potentially elevating entire families' social status through strategic unions. These weren't dating apps. They were social engineering projects designed to strengthen the patron's network while rewarding loyal clients with upward mobility. Historians still argue whether these marriage interventions represented genuine paternal concern or calculated network expansion. Contemporary sources suggest both motivations coexisted, with patrons genuinely caring about their clients' happiness, while simultaneously recognizing that grateful clients made better business partners and political allies. Business partnerships between patrons and clients created some of the most profitable enterprises in the ancient world. A patron might provide capital and connections, while his client contributed labor and management skills, splitting profits according to agreements that heavily favored the patron, but still provided clients with incomes far exceeding what they could earn independently. These partnerships often lasted generations, with families on both sides inheriting roles and responsibilities that shaped entire bloodlines' destinies. The gift economy extended to cultural and intellectual benefits that money couldn't directly purchase. Patrons provided their clients with access to exclusive social events, private libraries, philosophical discussions, and artistic performances that were completely inaccessible to ordinary Romans. Being invited to your patron's dinner parties meant networking opportunities that could transform your family's future for generations. You stand in the forum, watching a senator stride past, followed by a procession of 40 clients in matching white togas, and you realize you're witnessing the ancient world's most sophisticated display of social media influence, except these followers are real people whose lives depend on maintaining their patron's reputation. The number of clients trailing behind a Roman aristocrat served as a walking advertisement of his power, wealth, and political influence that was visible to everyone in the city. The mathematics of Roman social status operated on principles that would make modern influencer marketing seem subtle. Patrons literally counted their clients like social media metrics, competing with other aristocrats to see who could assemble the largest, most impressive entourage. Having 300 clients meant more than just having 300 people who owed you favors. It meant you controlled 300 votes, 300 potential soldiers, and 300 walking advertisements for your importance. Roman society developed elaborate protocols for displaying client relationships that rival modern celebrity red carpet strategies. When patrons attended public events, the arrangement of their clients communicated complex messages about relative status, recent achievements, and political alliances. The most favored clients walked immediately behind their patron, while lesser clients formed concentric circles of decreasing importance that everyone in attendance could read like a social hierarchy map. The toga itself became a crucial status symbol within the patronage system. While ordinary Romans might own one decent toga for special occasions, successful clients often received multiple togas from their patrons, different weights for different seasons, varying qualities for different events, and sometimes even togas with subtle decorative elements that indicated their special relationship with powerful benefactors. Walking around Rome in an obviously expensive toga was like wearing a designer label that announced your patron's wealth and your own favored status. Housing location served as another visible indicator of patronage success. Clients who received housing near their patrons' domus occupied prime Roman real estate, while those relegated to distant neighborhoods or upper floors of insulae buildings displayed their lower status for everyone to see. Your address literally advertised your position in the patronage hierarchy, making social climbing as visible as a change of neighborhood. The dining invitation system created perhaps the most complex status display mechanism in Roman society. Patrons hosted elaborate dinner parties where the seating arrangement, food quality, and conversation topics all reflected clients' relative positions in the social hierarchy. Being invited to recline next to your patron at a dinner party was like being seated in the VIP section at a concert. Everyone noticed, and everyone understood what it meant for your future prospects. But here's where Roman social currency gets genuinely fascinating. Patrons themselves were often clients of even more powerful patrons, creating nested hierarchies that would make modern corporate org charts look simple. A senator might have hundreds of clients, while simultaneously being client to consul, who himself might be client to a member of the imperial family. These interlocking relationships created social networks of staggering complexity, where status was always relative and constantly shifting. The gift-giving protocol within these relationships operated like a sophisticated economy where social capital replaced monetary transactions. Clients competed to give their patrons the most thoughtful, expensive, or rare gifts they could afford, while patrons demonstrated their wealth and taste through the quality of gifts they redistributed to their most favored clients. It was like a luxury item exchange where the real currency was respect and the real profit was influence. Historians still argue whether Romans genuinely enjoyed these elaborate status displays or simply endured them as necessary social obligations. Contemporary sources suggest both attitudes coexisted, with some aristocrats clearly reveling in their public prominence, while others complained privately about the exhausting demands of maintaining their client networks. The patronage system created a parallel economy where social services replaced monetary transactions in ways that fundamentally altered Roman capitalism. Instead of paying lawyers, hiring bodyguards, or purchasing business connections, clients provided these services to their patrons in exchange for protection, housing, and economic opportunities. It was like a barter system, except instead of trading goods, people traded years of their lives for security and status. Public spectacles provided the ultimate stage for displaying patronage relationships. When patrons sponsored gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, or religious festivals, they used these events to showcase their client networks, demonstrate their wealth, and compete with other aristocrats for popular acclaim. Clients played crucial roles in these displays, filling seats, cheering on cue, and providing visible evidence of their patrons' importance to the broader Roman public. The most successful patrons understood that social currency required constant maintenance and strategic reinvestment. They regularly promoted favored clients to more prominent positions within their networks, arranged marriages that elevated client families' status, and created opportunities for clients to demonstrate their own worth to the broader Roman community. It was like managing a human investment portfolio, where the returns were measured in loyalty, influence, and political power, rather than simple monetary profit. You wake each morning with the gnawing anxiety that today might be the day your patron decides you're no longer worth his investment, sending you tumbling back into the desperate masses of unprotected Romans scrambling for survival in the city's brutal social hierarchy. The daily performance of gratitude, submission, and usefulness becomes as exhausting as any physical labor, except this work involves constantly monitoring your patron's moods, anticipating his needs, and competing with dozens of other clients for his continued attention. The morning salutatio transforms you into a professional flatterer, carefully crafting compliments that stroke your patron's ego without seeming too obvious or desperate. You study his recent achievements, memorize details about his family, and prepare witty observations about current events that might earn you a moment of favorable attention. It's like being a personal entertainer whose audience holds your family's future in his hands, except the performance never ends, and the reviews are literally life or death. Competition among clients creates a social dynamic that would make reality TV producers weep with joy. You find yourself subtly undermining other clients while maintaining the appearance of collegial friendship, spreading just enough gossip to damage rivals without seeming malicious, and forming temporary alliances that shift based on your patron's current preferences. The most successful clients master the art of appearing humble while ruthlessly eliminating competition through strategic manipulation. Your patron's dinner invitations become the ultimate test of your current standing within his favor. The seating arrangement tells you everything you need to know about your relative status, while the quality of food served to different guests advertises their importance to everyone present. Being moved to a lower couch or served inferior wine sends a clear message that your stock is falling, triggering desperate attempts to redeem yourself through increased services or more lavish gifts. The gift-giving pressure creates a constant financial strain that keeps you perpetually on the edge of bankruptcy. You must present your patron with tokens of appreciation that demonstrate both your gratitude and your prosperity, but not so expensive that they suggest you're getting above your station, and not so cheap that they imply disrespect. Finding that perfect balance requires the financial planning skills of a modern hedge fund manager combined with the psychological insight of a marriage counselor. Emergency availability becomes a fundamental requirement that destroys any semblance of personal autonomy. When your patron needs witnesses for a legal proceeding, supporters at a political rally, or simply someone to accompany him on errands, you must drop everything and appear immediately with a smile and appropriate enthusiasm. Having your own family emergency or business crisis during these moments reveals the harsh reality that your patron's convenience more than your personal welfare. The rumor mill within client networks operates with the intensity of an intelligence agency, as everyone desperately seeks information that might help them anticipate their patron's needs or avoid his displeasure. You trade gossip about other patrons, political developments, and social scandals like currency, always hoping that being the first to bring your patron useful information might earn you temporary security in his good graces. Historians still argue whether clients genuinely admired their patrons or simply performed admiration out of necessity. Contemporary sources suggest that many clients developed genuine affection for their patrons over time, a phenomenon modern psychologists might recognize as Stockholm Syndrome, where dependence creates emotional attachment, even in exploitative relationships. The sexual dynamics within some patron-client relationships add another layer of complexity that Roman sources handle with euphemistic delicacy. Young male clients, particularly those from impoverished but educated families, sometimes found that their patron's interest extended beyond their political or business utility. Navigating these advances without offending their benefactors, while maintaining their own dignity-created psychological pressures that many clients found unbearable. Marriage and family life become subordinate to patronage obligations in ways that strain every personal relationship. Your spouse and children must understand that your patron's demands take precedence over family dinners, children's illnesses, or domestic crises. The most successful clients train their entire families to participate in the patronage system, teaching children to greet their patron respectfully, and wives to charm his female relatives. The constant performance of gratitude requires emotional labor that would exhaust modern therapy patients. You must appear genuinely thankful for every small favor, enthusiastically supportive of every patron decision, and perpetually optimistic about your future prospects within his service. Expressing doubt, frustration, or simple human fatigue risks being labeled ungrateful, a reputation that could destroy your relationship and leave your family destitute. Business opportunities that arise through patronage connections come with strings attached that often make them less profitable than they initially appear. Your patron might recommend you for lucrative contracts while expecting a significant percentage of the profits, or provide business capital while retaining controlling interest in your enterprise. These arrangements blur the line between opportunity and exploitation in ways that keep clients simultaneously grateful and resentful. The aging process adds particular cruelty to client relationships, as patrons naturally favor younger, more energetic clients who can provide better services and reflect more positively on their benefactor's vitality. Older clients find themselves gradually relegated to less prominent positions within their patron's network, watching younger men receive the opportunities and attention they once enjoyed, while struggling to maintain relevance in an increasingly youth-obsessed social system. You discover that Roman women, despite legal restrictions that would make modern feminists rage tweet for days, managed to wield patronage power that rivaled their male counterparts through a combination of inherited wealth, strategic marriages, and sheer cunning that puts modern political operatives to shame. The wives and daughters of wealthy Romans didn't just observe the patronage system from the sidelines. They actively participated as patrons, clients, and power brokers who shaped Roman society in ways that male-dominated historical sources often overlooked or deliberately minimized. Wealthy Roman matrons accumulated their own client networks through inheritance, dowries, and independent business ventures that generated substantial personal wealth. A senator's widow might inherit not only her husband's property, but also his client relationships, suddenly finding herself responsible for dozens of families' welfare while commanding their political loyalty. These women often proved more skillful patrons than their deceased husbands, understanding that their precarious legal position required more sophisticated relationship management and strategic thinking. The female patronage style developed its own distinct characteristics that reflected both women's social limitations and their unique advantages within Roman culture. Female patrons often specialized in cultural and religious sponsorship, funding temples, festivals, and artistic projects that enhanced their public reputation, while remaining within socially acceptable bounds for wealthy women. They couldn't run for political office or command armies, but they could shape public opinion through spectacular displays of piety and generosity. Marriage arrangements became a particularly powerful tool in female patrons' arsenals, as wealthy women could facilitate unions between their clients' children and other families within their social networks. Roman mothers understood that controlling marriage negotiations meant controlling the next generation's social position, creating long-term influence that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. A well-connected female patron could elevate entire families through strategic matchmaking that would make modern dating apps seem primitive. Salon culture that developed around wealthy Roman women created intellectual and social spaces where patronage relationships flourished outside traditional male-dominated venues. Female patrons hosted intimate gatherings where poets recited new works, philosophers debated current ideas, and political wives exchanged information that shaped their husbands' decisions. These salons provided women with platforms for exercising influence while maintaining the appearance of domestic respectability. But here's where female patronage gets particularly fascinating. Women often became clients of other women, creating same-gender networks that operated parallel to male patronage systems. A young aristocratic woman might seek patronage from an older, more established matron who could introduce her to influential social circles, arrange advantageous marriages for her children, or provide protection during family crises. These relationships combined mentorship, friendship, and economic dependency in ways that created powerful female alliances. The religious dimension of female patronage provided women with unique opportunities to exercise public influence while maintaining social acceptability. Wealthy women funded temple construction, sponsored religious festivals, and supported priestesses in ways that advertised their piety, while creating networks of grateful clients among Rome's religious communities. The goddess Vesta's priestesses, in particular, often developed patronage relationships with aristocratic women who funded their activities and sought their spiritual intercession. Historians still argue whether female patrons genuinely cared more about their clients' welfare than male patrons, or whether women's supposedly nurturing nature was simply another strategic tool in the patronage game. Contemporary sources suggest that female patrons often maintained longer, more personal relationships with their clients, but this might reflect women's need to build more stable networks to compensate for their legal vulnerabilities rather than innate maternal instincts. Business aspects of female patronage operated through legal proxies that created complex webs of hidden ownership and control. Women couldn't legally conduct many types of business, so they used male relatives, freedmen, or trusted clients as front men for their commercial enterprises. A wealthy woman might own several shops, workshops, or rental properties, while officially appearing to be a passive investor, creating economic empires that were largely invisible to historical record-keeping. Freedwomen, former female slaves who had purchased or earned their freedom, often developed particularly intense patronage relationships with their former mistresses that lasted throughout their lives. These relationships combined gratitude, continued dependence, and genuine affection in ways that created some of the most stable patron-client bonds in Roman society. A successful freedwoman might eventually become a patron herself, while maintaining client obligations to the woman who had freed her. The luxury goods market that catered to wealthy Roman women created opportunities for female clients to provide specialized services that male clients couldn't offer. Women skilled in cosmetics, jewelry making, textile work, or hairstyling could build client relationships with wealthy matrons based on their expertise in feminine luxury consumption. These relationships often proved more stable than male patronage connections because they were based on ongoing service needs rather than political calculations. Female patrons faced unique challenges in managing their client networks, as Roman law required them to work through male guardians for many official transactions, while social expectations demanded that they appear deferential to male authority, even when wielding considerable power. The most successful female patrons mastered the art of appearing subordinate, while actually controlling complex networks of dependents, allies, and business interests that would make modern corporate executives nod in recognition. The intergenerational aspect of female patronage created dynasties of influence that often proved more durable than male political careers. While men's fortunes rose and fell with political changes, electoral defeats, and military disasters, wealthy women could maintain their social positions and client networks across multiple generations by focusing on cultural, religious, and social influence rather than direct political involvement. These female dynasties often provided stability and continuity that helped Roman society whether it's frequent political upheavals. You find yourself standing in the campus Martius during election season, watching as thousands of Roman citizens mill about in carefully organized groups, each cluster representing a different patron's voting block in what amounts to the ancient world's most sophisticated vote-buying operation, disguised as civic participation. The air buzzes with barely concealed bribery as wealthy candidates distribute coins, promise jobs, and offer entertainment to citizens whose votes they need to purchase their way into political office. The Roman electoral system operated on the fundamental principle that votes were commodities to be bought, sold, and traded like any other valuable resource. Patrons didn't just influence their clients' voting decisions. They owned those votes outright through the bonds of obligation that defined their relationships. When your patron told you to vote for a particular candidate, you didn't consider it a suggestion. You considered it a direct order that disobedience could cost you your livelihood and your family's future. Campaign finance in the Roman Republic would make modern political donors seem restrained and ethical by comparison. Wealthy candidates borrowed enormous sums to fund their electoral campaigns, knowing that winning office would provide opportunities to recoup their investments through legal and illegal means. The consulship wasn't just a political honor, it was a business investment that successful candidates expected to pay dividends through provincial governorships, military commands, and access to state resources. Morning of elections transforms the city into a carnival of corruption, where citizens openly negotiate the price of their votes, while candidates pretend to respect the sacred traditions of Roman democracy. You watch as candidates' agents move through crowds, distributing small bags of coins, each bag representing not just a purchased vote, but a calculated investment in political power that will shape the empire's future for years to come. Tribal organization provided the structure through which vote buying operated most efficiently. Roman citizens were divided into 35 tribes, each representing a voting block that could be purchased wholesale by sufficiently wealthy candidates. Patrons who controlled large numbers of clients within specific tribes could essentially deliver entire tribal votes to their preferred candidates, creating a system where electoral outcomes were determined more by financial resources than popular support. The violence that often accompanied Roman elections reflected the high stakes involved in political patronage relationships. When patrons' preferred candidates faced defeat, they sometimes mobilized their clients for street fighting that could determine electoral outcomes through intimidation rather than persuasion. These riots weren't spontaneous expressions of political passion. They were carefully orchestrated displays of patron power designed to demonstrate the consequences of opposing well-connected candidates. But here's where Roman political patronage reveals its true sophistication. The system created interlocking networks of obligation that connected local politics with imperial governance in ways that made effective administration possible across the Mediterranean world. Provincial governors appointed through Roman elections brought their client networks with them, creating administrative systems that blended Roman authority with local cooperation through patronage relationships. The judicial dimension of political patronage ensured that electoral corruption rarely faced serious prosecution, since the courts themselves were staffed by men who had won their positions through the same corrupt practices they were supposed to investigate. Judges, prosecutors, and defendants all participated in patronage networks that made objective justice virtually impossible and turned legal proceedings into extensions of political competition. Historians still argue whether Roman electoral corruption represented a fundamental flaw in Republican government, or simply a different approach to political organization that modern democracies hypocritically condemn while practicing subtler forms of the same behavior. Contemporary sources suggest that Romans themselves were conflicted about their electoral practices, simultaneously celebrating democratic ideals while openly participating in vote-buying schemes. The collegia, professional associations, and neighborhood clubs provided another venue through which political patronage operated at the grassroots level. Wealthy patrons funded these organizations' activities while expecting their members to vote according to their benefactors' preferences. These groups combined social networking, professional development, and political organization in ways that created communities of dependence that extended far beyond simple economic relationships. Campaign promises in Roman elections often took the form of specific patronage commitments rather than abstract policy positions. Candidates promised to sponsor gladiatorial games, fund public works projects, or provide grain distributions that would benefit their supporters while creating new opportunities for client recruitment. Electoral platforms weren't ideological documents. They were business plans for expanding patronage networks. The role of women in political patronage created behind-the-scenes influence networks that often proved more durable than the formal electoral system. While women couldn't vote or hold office, wealthy matrons could influence their husbands, sons, and clients' political activities in ways that shaped electoral outcomes without leaving obvious historical traces. The most politically savvy women understood that indirect influence often proved more effective than direct participation. Provincial elections extended Roman political patronage throughout the Mediterranean world, as local elites sought Roman citizenship and political positions that would enhance their status within their own communities. These provincial politicians often became clients of Roman senators who could facilitate their advancement while gaining loyal supporters in strategically important regions throughout the empire. The economic impact of electoral spending created boom and bust cycles that affected Roman society at every level. Campaign seasons brought temporary prosperity to citizens who could sell their votes, artisans who provided campaign materials, and entertainers who performed at candidate-sponsored events. However, the debt incurred by losing candidates often resulted in financial crises that destroyed families and destabilized local economies throughout the Roman world. You enter the elegant villa of a wealthy Roman patron find poets nervously clutching scrolls of their latest works, sculptors presenting miniature models of proposed statues, and musicians tuning their instruments before an audience of one, the aristocratic benefactor, whose approval could transform struggling artists into celebrated cultural figures, or condemn them to obscurity and starvation. This is where Roman patronage reveals its most refined and psychologically complex dynamics, as creative minds navigate the treacherous waters between artistic integrity and financial survival. The relationship between Roman patrons and their artistic clients operated on principles that would make modern gallery owners and record label executives nod in recognition. Wealthy Romans collected artists like they collected exotic slaves or rare wines as displays of cultural sophistication that advertised their refinement while providing entertainment that enhanced their social status. A patron's stable of artists reflected his intellectual tastes and cultural aspirations in ways that mere wealth accumulation couldn't achieve. Poets occupied a particularly precarious position within the artistic patronage hierarchy, as their work required not just talent, but also the ability to flatter their benefactors without appearing obviously sycophantic. The greatest Roman poets, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, all depended on wealthy patrons for their survival, creating immortal literature while simultaneously producing commissioned verses that celebrated their benefactors' achievements, family histories, and political aspirations. The creative process under patronage involved constant negotiation between artistic vision and patron expectations. A poet might spend months crafting an epic about heroic deeds, only to discover that his patron preferred light verse about dinner parties and romantic escapades. The most successful artistic clients learned to present their patrons with multiple options, allowing wealthy benefactors to feel like collaborators in the creative process, while maintaining some degree of artistic autonomy. Visual artists faced different but equally challenging constraints, as their work required expensive materials that only wealthy patrons could provide. Sculptors needed marble, bronze, and skilled assistants. Painters required rare pigments and prepared surfaces. Architects needed entire construction budgets that could bankrupt ordinary Romans. This material dependence created relationships where artists' creative possibilities were literally determined by their patrons' financial generosity and aesthetic preferences. The commission system that developed around artistic patronage created a luxury market that drove innovation while simultaneously constraining creative freedom. Patrons competed to commission the most spectacular artworks, pushing artists to develop new techniques and explore ambitious projects that advanced Roman culture. However, this competition also meant that artists spent most of their time creating works designed to impress other wealthy Romans, rather than exploring personal artistic visions. Performance artists, actors, musicians, and dancers occupied the lowest rung of the artistic patronage ladder, as Roman society considered public performance, inherently degrading regardless of artistic merit. Even the most talented performers remained socially stigmatized, creating a paradox where patrons simultaneously enjoyed their services while looking down on their providers. This contradiction meant that performing artists often developed the most psychologically complex relationships with their benefactors. Historians still argue whether patronage enhanced or limited Roman artistic achievement. Some scholars contend that financial security allowed artists to focus on their craft without worrying about commercial success, while others argue that patron expectations prevented artists from exploring controversial or innovative themes that might offend their benefactors' sensibilities. The literary salon culture that surrounded wealthy patrons created spaces where artists could network, collaborate, and compete for attention in relatively intimate settings. These gatherings combined social entertainment with cultural exhibition, as patrons showed off their artistic collections, while artists performed for audiences that included potential new benefactors. The most successful artistic clients mastered the art of working these rooms, building relationships that could provide backup patronage if their primary benefactor lost interest. The education system that produced Roman artists often operated through patronage relationships, as wealthy families funded promising young people's artistic training in exchange for future loyalty and service. A senator might sponsor a talented slave's education in rhetoric or music, expecting that the eventual freedman would serve his family's cultural needs for decades. These educational investments created artistic dynasties that served the same patron families across multiple generations. The international dimension of artistic patronage brought Greek artists, Egyptian craftsmen, and Celtic metalworkers into Roman patron networks, creating cultural fusion that enriched Roman art while exploiting foreign talent. Wealthy Romans competed to acquire the most exotic artistic clients, viewing them as living trophies that demonstrated their cosmopolitan sophistication and imperial reach. Women played crucial roles as artistic patrons, often specializing in cultural sponsorship that allowed them to exercise public influence while maintaining social respectability. Wealthy Roman matrons funded poetry collections, sponsored musical performances, and commissioned artworks that advertised their family's cultural refinement. Female artistic clients, particularly those skilled in traditionally feminine arts like weaving, cosmetics, and jewelry making, often found more stable patronage relationships with women than with men. The religious dimension of artistic patronage created opportunities for artists to work on public projects that enhanced their reputations while serving their patrons' pious ambitions. Temple decoration, religious festivals, and sacred music provided artists with prestigious commissions that could launch their careers while allowing patrons to demonstrate their devotion to the gods. These religious projects often proved more artistically rewarding than private commissions because they allowed artists to explore spiritual and mythological themes. The economic pressures facing artistic clients created a boom and bust cycle that made long-term planning nearly impossible. A successful commission might provide months of financial security, but losing a patron's favor could result in immediate destitution. Many artists maintained multiple patron relationships to hedge against this uncertainty, but managing competing benefactors' expectations often proved more exhausting than the creative work itself. You witness the moment when chains fall away from a slave's wrists in a Roman household ceremony, but you quickly realize that this supposed liberation marks the beginning of a new form of bondage that will define the rest of his life and his children's lives in ways that make simple slavery seem almost straightforward by comparison. The transition from slave to freedman creates a patronage relationship so intense and permanent that it transforms legal freedom into a carefully constructed illusion designed to extract maximum value from human gratitude. The manumission ceremony itself reveals the calculated nature of Roman freedom, as masters carefully select which slaves to free based on their potential value as lifelong clients rather than any humanitarian impulses. The most skilled, intelligent, and loyal slaves earn their freedom precisely because their masters recognize that grateful ex-slaves often provide more valuable services than resentful current slaves. It's like a perverse employee promotion system where the reward for excellent performance is the opportunity to work even harder for the same boss. Freedmen discover that their legal freedom comes with obligations that would make modern employment contracts seem generous. They must continue living in their former master's household, provide labor services on demand, contribute portions of their earnings to their patron's income, and maintain absolute loyalty to the family that formerly owned them. Breaking these obligations could result in legal punishment, social ostracism, and economic destruction that would make their former slavery seem comfortable by comparison. The peculium system that allowed slaves to accumulate personal property often served as the foundation for freedmen's economic relationships with their former masters. Many slaves purchased their freedom using money they had earned and saved while in bondage, creating debt relationships that bound them to their patrons even more tightly than legal obligations. A freedman who had borrowed money for his manumission might spend decades repaying his patron while providing additional services to cover the interest on his freedom. Business partnerships between patrons and their freedmen created some of the most profitable enterprises in the Roman economy, while maintaining the social fiction that former masters and former slaves were now equals. A wealthy Roman might provide capital and connections, while his freedman contributed management skills and labor, splitting profits according to agreements that heavily favored the patron, while giving the freedman more income than he could ever have earned as a slave. The social stigma attached to freedman status created psychological pressures that often proved more difficult to bear than the economic obligations. Roman society never allowed former slaves to forget their origins, maintaining legal and social distinctions that marked freedmen as permanently inferior to freeborn citizens. Children of freedmen could achieve full citizenship, but only if they maintained perfect relationships with their parents, former masters, throughout their entire lives. Historians still argue whether manumission represented genuine Roman humanitarianism, or simply a more sophisticated form of exploitation that extracted maximum value from human resources. Contemporary sources suggest that both motivations coexisted, with some masters genuinely caring about their slaves' welfare, while others viewed manumission purely as a business strategy for maintaining productive workers without the overhead costs of slave ownership. The most successful freedmen learned to navigate their patron relationships by becoming indispensable to their former master's business operations, while gradually building independent client networks of their own. A freedman who managed his patron's commercial interests might develop relationships with suppliers, customers, and business partners that eventually allowed him to operate quasi-independently while maintaining the appearance of continued dependence. Women freedmen faced additional challenges as they tried to balance their obligations to former masters with their roles as wives and mothers in their own families. A freedwoman might find herself torn between her patron's demands for services and her husband's expectations for domestic support, creating conflicts that could destroy both relationships. The most successful freedwomen often remained unmarried, dedicating their lives entirely to serving their former mistresses. Religious dimension of freedman patronage created spiritual bonds that reinforced legal and economic obligations through appeals to divine authority. Former masters and former slaves often worshipped the same household gods, participated in the same religious festivals, and shared burial spaces that symbolized their eternal connection. These religious ties made breaking patronage relationships seem not just socially unacceptable, but spiritually dangerous. Imperial freedmen, former slaves of the emperor and his family, occupied a unique position within Roman society that demonstrated the complex relationship between legal status and practical power. Some imperial freedmen wielded enormous influence over government administration, while remaining technically inferior to freeborn citizens who possessed no political connections. Their success illustrated how patronage relationships could trump formal social hierarchies when backed by sufficient imperial authority. The generational aspect of freedman patronage created family dynasties bound to patron families through inherited obligations that lasted for centuries. A freedman's children inherited modified versions of their parents' client obligations, while their children might achieve full citizenship, but were still expected to maintain respectful relationships with their grandparents, former masters' descendants. These multi-generational bonds created social stability while perpetuating inequality across time. The economic mobility that some freedmen achieved through successful patronage relationships created a middle class that bridged the gap between slaves and freeborn citizens. Wealthy freedmen might own slaves themselves, operate substantial businesses, and live more comfortably than many freeborn Romans, while still maintaining client obligations to their former masters. This economic success often intensified the psychological complexity of their social position. Legal protections available to freedmen reflected their ambiguous status within Roman society, as they possessed more rights than slaves, but fewer protections than freeborn citizens. Former masters retained significant legal authority over their freedmen, including rights to inherit their property, control their marriages, and demand specific services that courts would enforce. This legal framework ensured that manumission created clients rather than truly independent individuals. You stand in the marble-columned atrium of the imperial palace, watching as senators, governors, and kings from across the known world compete for a few moments of the emperor's attention, each representing different levels of a patronage hierarchy that now encompasses the entire Mediterranean basin and transforms the personal relationship between patron and client into the fundamental organizing principle of the world's largest empire. The transformation of patronage under imperial rule magnified every aspect of the traditional system while adding layers of complexity that would make modern diplomatic protocol seem straightforward. The emperor became the ultimate patron, whose favor could elevate obscure individuals to positions of enormous power, while his displeasure could destroy entire families regardless of their wealth, connections, or previous achievements. Every Roman, from the humblest freedman to the most powerful senator, was now essentially a client in the emperor's vast household. Augustus revolutionized patronage by systematically converting the Roman aristocracy from independent power brokers into dependent clients who owed their positions, wealth, and influence to imperial favor. Senators who had once competed as equals for political office now competed for the emperor's approval, transforming the Roman Republic's competitive political culture into an imperial court's hierarchical submission ritual that would define European monarchy for the next 2 millennia. The Praetorian Guard represents perhaps the most visible symbol of imperial patronage, as these elite soldiers served not just as the emperor's bodyguards, but as his personal clients who owed their privileged positions, generous salaries, and retirement benefits to imperial generosity. Their loyalty was purchased through benefits that far exceeded normal military compensation, creating a military force that protected the emperor from his own subjects rather than defending Rome from external enemies. Imperial freedmen developed into a parallel governing class that wielded enormous administrative power while remaining technically inferior to freeborn citizens, demonstrating how patronage relationships could transcend traditional social hierarchies when backed by imperial authority. Former slaves like Narcissus and Pallas accumulated wealth and influence that rivaled senators while serving as their former masters, agents in governing the empire's complex bureaucracy. The grain-dole system that provided free food to Rome's urban population transformed traditional patronage, gift-giving, into imperial social policy, as emperors used massive public welfare programs to maintain the loyalty of potentially dangerous urban masses. These distributions weren't charity. They were carefully calculated political investments that purchased social stability while advertising imperial generosity to hundreds of thousands of potential clients simultaneously. But here's where imperial patronage reveals its true innovation. The emperor's relationship with provincial elites created a global network of local patrons who maintained Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean world by integrating indigenous power structures into the imperial hierarchy. Local kings, tribal chieftains, and city magistrates became imperial clients who governed their communities according to Roman interests while maintaining their traditional authority over their own subjects. The imperial cult that developed around emperor worship provided a religious framework that transformed political patronage into sacred obligation. As provincial communities built temples, sponsored festivals, and offered sacrifices that honored their imperial patron while demonstrating their loyalty to Roman rule. These religious expressions of patronage created cultural unity across the empire's diverse populations, while reinforcing the emperor's position as a quasi-divine benefactor. Historians still argue whether imperial patronage represented an evolution of traditional Roman values or a fundamental betrayal of republican ideals that transformed citizens into subjects. Contemporary sources suggest that Romans themselves were conflicted about these changes, simultaneously celebrating imperial achievements while mourning the loss of the competitive political culture that had made Rome great. The economic scale of imperial patronage dwarfed anything previously seen in the ancient world, as emperors controlled resources that allowed them to sponsor construction projects, military campaigns, and public entertainment on a scale that made private patrons seem insignificant by comparison. The Colosseum, imperial baths, and aqueduct systems represented patronage gifts to the Roman people that demonstrated imperial power while providing practical benefits that enhanced urban life. Military patronage under the empire created professional armies whose loyalty belonged to their imperial commander rather than to the Roman state, fundamentally altering the relationship between civilian government and military power. Soldiers swore personal oaths to the emperor, received their pay from imperial funds, and expected their retirement benefits from imperial generosity, creating military forces that served dynastic rather than national interests. The succession crises that plagued the imperial system often resulted from the inherent instability of patronage-based government, as emperors struggled to transfer their personal client relationships to their chosen heirs. Unlike hereditary monarchies, where legitimacy passed automatically through bloodlines, Roman imperial succession required each new emperor to rebuild the network of personal relationships that held the empire together. Provincial administration under imperial patronage created a system where governors served as the emperor's personal representatives rather than as officials of the Roman state, governing their territories according to imperial instructions while building their own client networks that could either support or threaten imperial authority. The The most successful provincial governors balanced their loyalty to the emperor with their cultivation of local elites who could provide information, resources, and political support. The cultural impact of imperial patronage extended far beyond politics and economics, as emperors sponsored artistic projects, architectural innovations, and intellectual developments that shaped Mediterranean civilization for centuries. Imperial libraries, schools, and cultural institutions created educational opportunities that produced generations of artists, scholars, and administrators who served imperial interests while advancing human knowledge. The legal system under imperial patronage evolved to reflect the emperor's role as the ultimate source of justice, as legal appeals increasingly focused on gaining imperial attention rather than winning cases through evidence and argument. The emperor's legal decisions became precedents that shaped Roman law, while access to imperial justice became another benefit that emperors could grant to favored clients while withholding from their enemies. You witness the moment when a trusted client's betrayal destroys a prominent senator's career, watching as decades of carefully cultivated loyalty evaporate in a single act of treachery that reveals the fundamental instability lurking beneath Rome's sophisticated patronage system, like a psychological time bomb waiting to detonate at the worst possible moment. The relationships that created Roman civilization contained the seeds of its destruction, as the same personal bonds that generated loyalty and cooperation could transform into weapons of devastating revenge when they inevitably collapsed. The most spectacular patronage scandals often involved sexual relationships that crossed the carefully maintained boundaries between social classes, as wealthy patrons used their power to exploit vulnerable clients in ways that created explosive blackmail opportunities when the relationship soured. A senator's affair with a client's wife or daughter might remain secret for years, until political competition motivated the client to expose his patron's behavior, destroying reputations and ending careers with revelations that shocked even Rome's remarkably tolerant social standards. Financial corruption within patronage relationships created cascading scandals that could topple entire political networks when they were exposed. Patrons who embezzled public funds to maintain their client networks, or clients who defrauded their patrons' business interests, created fraud schemes that implicated dozens of prominent Romans in criminal enterprises that made modern political corruption seem amateurish by comparison. These financial scandals often revealed the extent to which legitimate Roman business depended on illegal practices. The inheritance disputes that arose when patrons died, without clearly designating which clients should receive what benefits, created legal battles that could last for decades while destroying family relationships and social networks. Former clients might discover that their patrons' legitimate heirs refused to honor informal agreements, leading to court cases that exposed the private details of patronage relationships while highlighting the legal ambiguity that made these bonds both powerful and fragile. Political betrayals within patronage networks created some of the most dramatic moments in Roman history, as clients who had received years of benefits suddenly turned against their patrons when political circumstances changed or better opportunities arose. The most devastating betrayals often occurred during civil wars, when clients had to choose between personal loyalty and political survival, creating conflicts that tore Roman society apart along the fault lines of patronage relationships. But here's where patronage scandals reveal their true social impact. The collapse of major patron-client networks often triggered economic crises that affected thousands of Romans as dependent businesses failed. Client families lost their income sources, and entire neighborhoods that depended on patronage spending fell into poverty. These ripple effects demonstrated how deeply patronage relationships had penetrated Roman economic life. The blackmail opportunities created by patronage relationships gave clients unprecedented power over their patrons when they possessed compromising information about illegal activities, sexual indiscretions, or financial improprieties. Some clients built entire careers around subtly threatening to expose their patrons' secrets unless they received continued benefits, creating relationships that resembled extortion more than traditional patronage bonds. Historians still argue whether the scandals that plagued Roman patronage represented inevitable consequences of the system's inherent contradictions, or simply isolated cases of individual moral failure that shouldn't reflect on the institution as a whole. Contemporary sources suggest that Romans themselves recognized the potential for abuse within patronage relationships, while continuing to participate in them because the alternatives seemed worse. The religious scandals that erupted when patrons and clients participated in forbidden cults together created political crises that combined religious persecution with social network destruction. The Bacchanalian conspiracy of 186 BCE, for example, implicated hundreds of Romans in secret religious practices that supposedly included murder, fraud, and sexual deviancy, leading to mass executions that destroyed numerous patronage networks while revealing the government's fears about alternative loyalty systems. Women's involvement in patronage scandals often received disproportionate attention from male historians who viewed female participation in political networks as inherently suspicious or immoral. Wealthy women who maintained their own client networks faced accusations of sexual impropriety, political conspiracy, and social subversion that reflected Roman anxieties about female power rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing. The generational conflicts that arose when sons refused to honor their father's patronage commitments created social crises that highlighted the system's dependence on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. Young aristocrats who viewed their inherited clients as burdensome obligations rather than valuable assets often abandoned these relationships, leaving former clients without protection while weakening the social bonds that held Roman communities together. Military patronage scandals created particularly dangerous situations when generals used their client relationships with soldiers to challenge civilian authority or pursue personal ambitions that threatened the stability of the Roman state. The loyalty that soldiers felt toward their commanding officers often superseded their loyalty to Rome itself, creating the conditions for civil wars that devastated the empire while enriching successful military patrons. Judicial corruption that patronage relationships enabled created a legal system where wealth and connections mattered more than evidence or justice, leading to spectacular miscarriages of justice that undermined public confidence in Roman institutions. Famous trials often devolved into competitions between rival patronage networks rather than searches for truth, as lawyers, judges, and witnesses all participated in the same corrupt relationships they were supposed to regulate. The economic scandals that emerged when clients used their patrons' resources for personal enrichment created business failures that revealed the extent to which Roman commerce depended on trust relationships that had no legal enforcement mechanisms. When these trust relationships collapsed, the economic consequences often affected entire industries as supply chains, credit networks, and business partnerships dissolved simultaneously. The psychological trauma that patronage betrayals inflicted on both patrons and clients created lasting social wounds that affected Roman culture's attitude toward trust, loyalty, and personal relationships. The literature of the late Republic and early Empire reflects a growing cynicism about human nature that may have resulted from the repeated collapse of patronage bonds that Romans had believed were permanent and sacred. You find yourself recognizing uncomfortably familiar patterns as you observe how ancient Roman patronage relationships mirror the power dynamics that shape your own contemporary world. From corporate mentorship programs and political fundraising networks to social media, influence hierarchies, and academic advisor relationships that combine genuine support with subtle exploitation in ways that would make Roman patrons nod in recognition across the centuries. The corporate world has reconstructed many aspects of Roman patronage through executive sponsorship programs, where senior managers select promising junior employees for special development opportunities that create loyalty bonds remarkably similar to ancient client relationships. These modern patrons provide career advancement, networking opportunities, and protection from corporate politics, while expecting dedication, availability, and reflected credit that echoes the demands Roman patrons placed on their dependents. Political campaign finance systems operate on principles that directly descend from Roman electoral patronage. As wealthy donors purchase access and influence through contributions that create ongoing obligations between politicians and their financial supporters. The quid pro quo relationships that define modern political fundraising would be immediately recognizable to Roman senators who understood that electoral success required building networks of grateful beneficiaries who could be mobilized for future political needs. Academic patronage relationships between professors and graduate students recreate many of the psychological dynamics that characterized Roman mentor-client bonds. As senior scholars provide research opportunities, recommendation letters, and career guidance, while expecting research assistance, intellectual deference, and professional loyalty that can extend throughout entire academic careers. The power imbalances inherent in these relationships create potential for both genuine mentorship and subtle exploitation. Social media influencer culture represents perhaps the most direct modern parallel to Roman patronage systems, as content creators depend on wealthy sponsors for their income, while maintaining audiences that function as client networks, providing attention, engagement, and social validation. The most successful influencers master the same skills that made Roman clients valuable: entertaining their patrons, maintaining constant availability, and projecting gratitude while subtly competing with rivals for continued support. But here's where the modern parallels become particularly unsettling. Contemporary society has largely forgotten the explicit nature of these dependency relationships, allowing similar power dynamics to operate without the formal acknowledgement and reciprocal obligations that made Roman patronage relatively transparent. Modern patrons often wield equivalent power while accepting fewer responsibilities for their dependents' welfare. The venture capital ecosystem that funds technological innovation operates through investor-entrepreneur relationships that closely resemble Roman patronage, as wealthy individuals and institutions provide capital and connections while expecting equity stakes, board positions, and strategic influence that can determine startup companies' futures. Successful entrepreneurs often become patrons themselves, creating networks of dependency that shape entire industries. Legal systems throughout the developed world still reflect Roman concepts of patronage through law firm partnership structures, where senior partners sponsor junior associates' career development while expecting billable hour commitments, client development contributions, and firm loyalty that mirrors ancient client obligations. The most prestigious legal careers often depend on securing powerful patrons who can provide case assignments and partnership opportunities. Historians still argue whether recognizing these modern parallels should inspire reform efforts to create more equitable relationships, or simply acknowledge that patronage represents a fundamental aspect of human social organization that will inevitably reemerge in different forms regardless of institutional attempts to eliminate it. Contemporary social scientists increasingly view patronage as a universal human tendency rather than a specifically Roman innovation. The psychological research on mentor-protege relationships has identified many of the same benefits and risks that characterized Roman patronage, including enhanced career development opportunities, increased professional networks, and improved performance outcomes, as well as potential for exploitation, dependency creation, and ethical conflicts that can damage both parties when relationships deteriorate. Nonprofit organizations and charitable foundations recreate patronage dynamics through donor relationships that combine philanthropic motivations with social status considerations, as wealthy benefactors provide funding while expecting recognition, influence over organizational decisions, and access to exclusive social networks that enhance their cultural capital. The most successful nonprofit leaders master patron management skills that would be familiar to Roman clients. The entertainment industry perpetuates patronage relationships through talent management systems where established stars, producers, and executives sponsor emerging artists' careers while expecting personal loyalty, creative control, and financial participation that can bind artists to their benefactors for entire careers. These relationships often begin with genuine mentorship, but can evolve into exploitative arrangements that limit artistic freedom. International development aid operates through patronage principles, as wealthy nations and organizations provide resources to developing countries while expecting political alignment, economic concessions, and cultural influence that recreate colonial relationships through seemingly voluntary partnerships. These modern patronage networks shape global politics in ways that directly parallel Roman imperial administration of client kingdoms. The technological disruption of traditional employment has created gig economy platforms that fragment Roman-style patronage into micro-relationships between service providers and customers, eliminating the long-term security and mutual obligations that made ancient patronage sustainable while maintaining the fundamental power imbalances that characterized these relationships. As you consider these modern echoes of ancient patronage, you begin to understand that Roman social organization wasn't a historical curiosity, but rather a sophisticated response to universal human needs for security, advancement, and belonging that continue to shape contemporary relationships despite our democratic ideals and egalitarian aspirations. The patterns persist because they address fundamental aspects of human nature that transcend specific cultural and historical circumstances. The recognition of these continuities might inspire either cynical acceptance of inevitable inequality or determined efforts to create institutional structures that provide the benefits of patronage relationships while minimizing their potential for exploitation. Perhaps the Roman experience offers both cautionary lessons about the dangers of unchecked patronage and practical insights into managing these relationships more ethically and sustainably. The soft glow of tonight's journey fades as you drift toward sleep, carrying with you the understanding that the Roman sugar daddies who walked the Forum 2 millennia ago live on in countless modern relationships that shape your world in ways both subtle and profound. Their legacy reminds us that human social organization tends toward patronage despite our best intentions otherwise, and that recognizing these patterns might be the first step toward managing them more consciously and compassionately. The ancient Romans understood something about human nature that we've partially forgotten: that most relationships involve elements of mutual dependence, strategic calculation, and genuine affection that resist simple categorization as either pure exploitation or pure altruism. Their patronage system acknowledged these complexities while creating structures that channeled human tendencies towards social cooperation rather than destructive competition. As the warmth of sleep embraces you, let the Roman voices fade into whispers of marble halls and forum stones, knowing that tomorrow's world will continue to be shaped by the eternal dance between those who have power and those who need it, those who can give and those who must receive, in patterns as old as civilization itself and as contemporary as your next professional networking event or social media interaction.